As this whole thing has gone on, the timeline surrounding Stephen Woodford, aka Rationality Rules, and his attack on the human rights of trans women has become rather tangled. A lot of people joining the discussion now don't realise the full scope of the timeline of what has happened, something which is impacting the way they perceive things now. So I thought doing a fully referenced timeline might help some people in that regard. So this whole ordeal began when Stephen Woodford published his original video on trans athletes on the 29th of March. Said video was instantly picked up by far-right individuals and anti-trans organisations who began using it as a means to both delegitimise and attack trans women. I was sent the video by numerous trans people, so much in fact I had to publicly request for that to stop. I also saw it spring up in various circles I am part of as an attempt to further marginalise us. I had to do something, so I set about going through Woodford's references and carrying out my own research. What I discovered was that Woodford had no basis for the statements he had made. Statements which positioned trans women as a threat to the very existence of women's sports. Something which needed to be acted upon. Which is incredibly troubling since excluding a group of women from women's sports violates numerous human rights. But not only did he lack any ethical grounds to exclude trans women, what was even more telling was the science Woodford had attempted to use. Woodford set out to utilise a bait and switch. He invited his viewers in with promises of discussion surrounding trans women on HRT compared to cis women, only to switch to information on cis men compared to cis women. No form of anti-androgen involved. He also asserted that various things known to change with HRT didn't. This included hemoglobin, which he forwarded as one of the most important elements to his argument. To top this off, Woodford utilised various dog whistles, such as refusing to label cis women as such. Instead, he referred to them as simply biological women, implying that trans women were biological men and therefore not true women. He also used clips of Joe Rogan screaming, "He is a guy," in relation to trans women, ending his video on such a clip, marking that as the very last thing he wants his audience to hear and to take away from the video as a whole. He also resorted to various sensationalized news stories which he inaccurately portrayed, so his video delegitimized and in many instances dehumanized trans people, propped up our human rights as a topic of debate, and emboldened bigots with pseudoscience, all of which is still actively harming the trans community. So I compiled everything I found and published a response on the 6th of April, which, outside of certain segments of his audience, was well received. Everything I stated was clearly referenced in an accessible manner. But Woodford did not take kindly to being criticised. He rather famously stated that he'd watched 6 minutes of my video, and that was all he'd watched since I had the audacity to note his flirtations with the far right. Rather hypocritical considering that he complained about people not watching the whole of his video, which opened with him presenting trans women as a threat, before commenting on his transphobic content. Move forward 2 days and we'd finally reached an uneasy truce. He'd convinced me that he would check out my work and correct anything he'd got wrong, and I accepted that and sat there patiently. The only thing I did was publish a video asking attendees of Faithless Forum 2019, which Woodford was presenting at, to keep an ear out for people trying to claim that I was unnecessarily fragmenting the secular community, and correct them if they did. Thankfully, all that happened was someone asked Woodford a question about the subject, and he said he was working on an updated video. Now, I was accused by one of the event's organisers of instigating violence to a level comparable to burning down Kingdom Halls. When pressed on this, they kept asserting that we'd have to wait for the video to see what my fans had apparently done, none of which ever emerged. I still haven't received a sincere apology from either the individual or the Faithless Forum for their libelous accusations. Now, whilst in the US, Woodford went on the Atheist community of Austin's Atheist Experience show with host Matt Dillahunty on the 28th of April and again on the 5th of May. So a day short of a month had passed between Woodford's original video and his first appearance on the show. 3 weeks since my response, during which Woodford had been at home for the vast majority of that time, and yet the most he did was tweet the following on the 1st of May. Hey all, I'm currently working on a video in which I both clarify my views on transgender athletes, including how my views have altered, and publicly apologise for the ignorant language that I used and the mistakes that I made. Please PM me if you have more info for me to digest. End quote. And that was all, just an ambiguous mistakes that I made. Meanwhile, his video remained up completely unedited, with no clear indication that it contained errors, let alone what said errors were, profiteering off of the harm he was still inflicting on the trans community. But it was something, and people such as Mr. Atheist, Shannon Q, Suries, and various others kept telling me to give him time. So I kept the peace and waited for another week. That's when the ACA stepped in and published its public condemnation of Woodford's original video, rightfully noting it as transphobic content. Do note, it wasn't Woodford's first transphobic video, just his most blatant. Adding on to this, the ACA stated that they should have waited until after Woodford had clarified his views on the matter, or at the very least asked him about how they changed on air. They finished with a statement of solidarity with the LGBT+ community, since Woodford had called for the removal of trans women's human rights. And that was all. They didn't attack him, they didn't paint him as this raging transphobe out there beating us up on the street. They simply noted he had published transphobic content, and that they were sorry for giving him airtime until he had corrected it. Now there is an issue here with the way that the ACA downplayed their knowledge of the problem, not simply because Matt, the host of the show, had posted in support of Woodford less than 3 hours after his original video had been published, pretending like he had some right to declare it transphobia free. But listening to people who have since left the ACA, this human rights issue was known and they still chose to run with Woodford as a host. All of a sudden, after 5 weeks of doing nothing substantial to repair the damage Woodford had inflicted upon the trans community, Woodford managed to produce a video comparing himself to Galileo in less than 48 hours of the ACA's public statement. At which point I gave up on waiting around and decided to drag him out for the fact that he had failed to take even the most basic steps towards fixing the issue. I dragged him out over the fact that he hadn't removed or made clear that his video contained errors, something he could have done much earlier with 2 clicks or a simple change of the title. I called him out over the fact that he was still monetizing said video after the ACA condemnation, and I demanded very clearly that he donate the money to a trans charity. And only as I did that, refusing to give up, to back down as so many had demanded I do so before, did things start to change. He then changed the title of his video. He then demonetized it. Not before. And to be clear, his donation of the money that video had made wasn't enough. Said video had lined his pockets via Patreon and bolstered his channel. So this idea that giving the money said video had made is enough is insulting to everyone's intelligence. He didn't just profit directly from that video, something a lot of people have just brushed under the rug. Now, because I refused to stand by as I had done the month before, the abuse levied against me by Woodford's audience and supporters was stepped up a notch. But it wasn't just me they went after. The same people swarmed over the ACA networks in a tidal wave of transphobic, homophobic and racist rhetoric. It got so bad that there were a series of mass walkouts by volunteers over the abuse they suffered at the hands of Woodford's audience, and a lack of support from key figures in the ACA. The same ACA they were volunteering their time for. Following the abuse, the ACA did the worst thing imaginable, and went back on its original statement on the 16th of May, dropping its support for the LGBT+ community and pretending like Woodford's video wasn't a problem. To add insult to injury, they flat out apologised to Woodford for disavowing his transphobic video. On May the 18th, there was also an election at the ACA in which the pro-Woodford crowd turned up in force. First-hand accounts detail how anyone in support of the original statement was endlessly grilled for their position, unlike those who supported Woodford. I'd just like to note that 2 of the people elected are quite literally Woodford's drinking buddies on the Faithless forum. Just a little insert on something I learned after recording. Turns out that not only is Drew McCoy one of Woodford's drinking buddies and personal friends, but he actually violated the ACA bylaws in order to be elected onto the board. Under qualifications, said bylaw reads as quote, "Directors shall be members of the ACA for 6 months or more prior to election," end quote. Which is interesting since Drew McCoy wasn't a member of the ACA at the time the 2019 elections took place. Now what's really interesting is that a similar situation occurred last year in which a woman wanted to run for a board position even though she only had 4 months of ACA membership under her belt, which is still 4 more than Drew, and yet she was found to be ineligible to run. And I have had it confirmed by numerous people that this issue was raised at this election, and it was subsequently ignored. So whilst others with actual ACA membership are blocked from running, the people currently in power at the ACA are all too happy to ignore the same bylaws in order to replace board members that remain critical of Stephen Woodford with his personal friends. I should also mention that 2 months later, and the minutes of said election still haven't been released. At the same election, people who forwarded tighter vetting for guest hosts on grounds that the ACA was no longer a small show but an atheist celebrity mill were also targeted with hostility. The message that sent out was very clear. The cis-white atheists are above criticism, and anyone who dares challenge that is not welcome at what was once the atheist community of Austin. All of this culminated in more walkouts, including adored hosts who had been with the ACA for years, even decades. People who made the ACA the name it was until recently. People like Tracy, Jen, Claire, and Phil. Now, some of the walkouts had formed a support group which I was later added to. And reading through their accounts is truly horrifying. Many discuss the abuse they suffered thanks to Woodford and his audience. There are numerous discussions on how their sleep was impacted, how they're having to see psychiatrists and other specialists. I've even seen posts discussing suicide in relation to what had occurred. That's the level of severity we are talking about with this issue. People discussing suicide. That's the damage Woodford and his supporters have caused this one group, this one organisation. On the 20th of May, Woodford finally released his apology video, only for it to quickly become apparent that it wasn't an apology video, but a non-apology video. Woodford opens the video with an attack on the very community that he had harmed, tone policing the trans people who stood up to him, which is really rich considering that I waited for a month for him to do the right thing before I jammed my boot up his ass. He also rolled out his token trans person, a trans person who has gone on record stating that she will fight for fascists and their right to hate speech, because apparently said individual proves how not a transphobe Woodford is. I of course responded, noting all of this and many other issues with his video on the 25th of May. Woodford then went ahead and published his Mistakes of Many video on the 28th of May. Said video was meant to acknowledge his many scientific errors, yet spent the vast majority of the time lying about the science and attempting to dump his anecdotal arguments onto me to make me look bad. Most impressively, he repeated a mistake he had just admitted to making in his first video with hemoglobin, this time with muscle mass, something which could have been avoided had he just bothered to read the figure annotation of the graph he displayed on screen. Figure annotation included. So I noted this in my video response on the 5th of June. So by this point, it was pretty clear. Woodford was not abandoning his transphobic narratives he had constructed in his original video. He was simply trying to find ways to keep them in spite of having no basis for them to begin with. I was vindicated in saying this when, on the 15th of June, Woodford posted his updated video. Said video contained all the same dishonest tactics such as the bait and switch and the dehumanizing dog whistles. It even contained Woodford actively lying about the contents of various studies to try and bolster his case. He claimed that they showed heart and lung size as well as muscle fiber type to remain the same, in spite of HRT. This is even though none of those things are even mentioned in said articles in any context, relevant or otherwise. As I noted in my subsequent response, published on the 22nd of June, which I'd just like to note is the very first time I have ever labelled Woodford as transphobic in a video. Now since then the response has been a little underwhelming. I mean, many of the people who promised they'd step in if Woodford failed to change have either remained silent or even come after me for sticking up for my human rights, because apparently the secular community has a statute of limitations on internal affairs. I can effectively make the same video on the Kalam cosmological argument for 8 years running, but the moment I spend part of my time addressing transphobic bigotry in the secular community on a matter of my human rights, that's me being obsessive or beating a dead horse. There's a double standard at play here, one that I'm not all that keen in adhering to. So over the coming weeks, I'll be covering a variety of issues which took place on the sidelines. I'll be publishing testimonies of many of the ACA volunteers, sponsors, and community members who have since walked out. I'll be covering the dishonesty of people such as Matt Dillahunty and Holy Kool-Aid in greater detail. All because I have a passion, a desire to see the secular community grow into what it should be. A community welcoming to all marginalised groups, groups which have historically been the victims of religious institutions. Why? Well, because I believe as a militant secularist that unless we can offer something better than religion to all people, our dream will remain just that. When it can be so much more. And all it takes us is some goddamned accountability. As always, please check out our other videos. You can also support Essence of Thought by Patreon, and in doing so, help us become ad-free. On that note, we'd just like to say a big thank you to everyone who's already given to the channel, giving a special thanks to the following people: Hannah Banghart, Matthew Kovac, Brad R, McGay, Amit Devojny, Daniel Martinez, Robert McCallan, Sam Braxton, Atlas5, and Jennifer Hiller. And for myself and Adita, take care now.